So when I was being born at the hospital, my aunt, she was trying to get to the hospital because she was working late, so she tried to get there as fast as she could. So she was like driving recklessly. She like almost ran into two cars and two red lights, and she like got a ticket, and the police officer asked her like why she was driving so recklessly, and she said she was like so excited to see me at the hospital because it was a very important day and she wanted to be there to see me at the hospital. So it was like, so that's my story.
My story was told by my uncle, and it is about a near death experience that he had when he was younger. So, my uncle, who was 11 or 12 at the time, was driving home with his dad, and when they were coming home, my papi was smoking, and like his daily routine, and he threw the cigarette out the window, and the wind brought it back into the car, and my uncle's window was opened, and it hit him in the arm, and within seconds his arm caught on fire. He started screaming and yelling at my grandfather, and since he was driving and he was a little mad at him, he was like, "Be quiet, I'm driving." And so he started screaming louder, "My dad, like, I'm on fire." And he was like, "Oh." So he took a spare water bottle on the floor, pulled over, and put him out. That's my story.
So this is a story about how I almost wasn't born. So my grandma and my grandpa, they used to live in Ireland, and so obviously they met and they went on a date and they started dating, and then one day my grandma met a man named Mr. Morgan, and he asked her on a date, but she told him no because she had just met my grandpa. And then so my grandma and my grandpa went to America, and then they got married there. And Mr. Morgan and both my grandparents ended up being good friends, and Mr. Morgan moved in with his wife right next to my grandparents, and now they're really good friends. But if my grandma hadn't said no to the date with Mr. Morgan, my dad wouldn't have been born, and then I wouldn't have been born. So that's my story.
Um, my story is about my grandpa, who was a big construction guy in the industry, and he actually lived in Orange when when my dad was a kid. He came to Wallingford and built all the ridges and named them, but he told us never to tell anyone because no one likes their names and they're really confusing. So if we told anyone, then they would get mad. And then he went on to start his own construction company, and that's my story.
My story's about everything my great uncle George did in his life. He was born in Sparta, Greece, and when he was young, he moved to the U.S. with his family. When he got there, he taught himself how to speak English from a textbook, but that's not the only language. He also taught himself how to speak German, Spanish, French, and Greek, all from a textbook. You could tell already he was going to be a special person. Later in his life in the U.S., George began to work for the CIA as an interpreter. He would go to different places and translate for the CIA. Because of this job, he has visited every single country in the world, and as well as visited every single state in the United States. After his 11 years with the government, he moved on to work with the Defense Department as another interpreter. He is retired now and is 84 years old. He lives in Washington, D.C., so we never get to see him. He still has a house in Greece, but he doesn't move there much, or visit it often. That's my story.
My story is about my great grandfather and how he came over to America. In 1914, my grandfather was about 15 years old, and he lived in a village in Poland, which was near was near Russia. And in 1914, World War I started, so the Russians would go into Polish villages, and would force all the young men into the Russian military. So when he was 15, him and his cousin left for America, and they had all the money that their family could give or could gather up, which was $20. So they left for Germany and boarded a steamer called the Berlin, and they traveled to America, and they went through Ellis Island and became a citizen in the United States. And that's my story.
My story is about what my grandpa did on a rainy day. So my grandpa was 14 and he couldn't wait to drive. So while my great grandpa was still asleep, he took my great grandpa's white truck out for a quick drive. And since it was a rainy day, he was driving a little to the side of the road, and so he got stuck in the mud. And my grandpa had to walk all the way back home to get my great grandpa. And when they finally got the truck out, my great grandpa was still mad at my grandpa, and that's my story.
My story is about how my aunt had her battle for breast cancer, and like when she first, like before she even had breast cancer, she was like healthy and happy, and like she was like fine. And then as soon as like the breast cancer hit, she started like getting a little depressed, and she started losing weight like more and more every day, and she started losing all her hair too. And so she just like went into a full-on depression mode, and she just like didn't want to talk to anyone, didn't want to do anything, like she wasn't happy. But then like we all we gathered all like our family and friends, and we went over to the hospital where she was staying, and we went upstairs and we talked to her, and we like showed her like we're here for her, and that she has support, and that we're always just gonna be there for her. And like slowly she realized it, and she started getting happier and happier every day. And then like she started getting healthier too, and so like now she's happy and healthy, and she says it's all because we supported her all through her battle. And that's my story.
My story is about how my uncle had been in the military, and from 1939 to 1945, he was in the war, and he had his bravery to like defeat all these people. And so one day when he was going out to the war, he got shot in the leg, and then he had to go to the hospital to get treatment for it. And after he got treatment for it, he went back to the war and started to defeat people, and from now on, like we like remember the story and talk it to like have a conversation with our family to discuss about the story. And that's my story.
My story is about my great grandfather and his garbage business. And his name was Elijah Gibson, and he raised 17 children with his wife, Mabel Gibson. And he picked up trash all around town in Hamden, Cheshire, Meriden, and New Haven. And it started in 1931, and he did it until he died, and that's my story.
My story was told to me by my family and my uncle and mom. When like my mom and uncle were little, my mom and like their family from Vermont, they all got together, and they were all hanging out. And my uncle decided to climb in a tree, and his scarf got stuck on one of the branches, and he was like hanging by his scarf, and like my mom's cousin Chris had to climb up the tree and like unattach his scarf from the branch, and that's my story.
Okay, my story is about my great uncle Mario and how he lost his hearing. And he was a paratrooper when he was younger, and he trained people to jump from parachutes into war zones. And one day, the general giving orders for where they were going to jump gave the wrong orders, and they all jumped into a forest. And all of them got hurt, including my Uncle Mario, and he hit something on the way down and broke his arm and lost his hearing for good, and he was only 20. And so he hasn't been able to hear ever since. And that's my story. My story is about my great-grandma, and my grandma always tells me this. It's about when my great-grandma was a kid and she got tricked. My great-great-grandparents were immigrants from Italy, and they came and settled in Paterson, New Jersey. They had 9 children. They owned a grocery store, and there was little money for luxuries, like such as a doll or toys. When my great-grandma Angela was 7, she would pass by this house every day on her way to school where 2 spinster sisters lived, and that means that they were old and unmarried. And they had a big window, and she would look at it, and in it was a doll, and it was dressed in a bonnet and lovely clothes. And the ladies noticed her staring one day, and they came up with a plan to trick her. One day on her way home from school, she saw that the doll was missing. And a week went by, and the doll still never returned. And so finally, she summoned up the nerve to knock on the door. And the ladies told her that they dropped the doll and her head broke off. And they knew that her parents owned a grocery store. So they told her that if they brought them oil and eggs, they'll be able to fix the doll. My great-grandma was really scared, but she sneaked 1 dozen eggs and a tin of olive oil out of the store and giving it to the ladies. A week later, the doll was still missing from the window. She knocked on the door, and the ladies kept telling her that they needed more oil and eggs. Thinking that they would make a paste out of it to glue the head on. Several weeks went by and several more dozen eggs and tins of olive oil, and she thought something was fishy, so she went to investigate. One day she noticed that the ladies were having company, and so being as small as she was, she slipped through the door unnoticed and hid behind the stove. And she heard one lady say to the other, "Get out the oil and the eggs." And at last, my great-grandma thought that they were going to fix the doll. Then she heard them say, "Have some eggs, they're so delicious." And my great-grandma jumped up with her hands on her hips, stomping her feet, and yelled, "So that's what you've been doing with my mommy and daddy's oil and eggs?" And the ladies were surprised because she didn't know where she came from. And my great-grandma ran into the living room, and there was the doll sitting on the couch, untouched. And when the ladies caught up to her, she was thrown out of the house, and she warned to tell her parents. But she never did because she thought she was going to get in trouble. A week later, the apartment was empty, and the ladies had moved out. And she heard her parents talking, and they said, "Hey, Dominic, we're selling lots of eggs lately." And he said, "Yes, Maria, and lots of oil, too." And that's my story.
My story is about my great-grandma, told to me by my grandma. And my great-grandmother was born on actually a boat coming from when she was immigrating from Germany. And she was really pregnant when she first got on the ship. And her husband didn't want her to go because he didn't want her to have the baby on the ship. But she said no. And then she was born on the ship. And my grandma tells me that story a lot because she thinks that it's pretty funny. And she probably wouldn't have come to America if because her husband was only paying for them to go on the ship once. And then she probably would have stayed in Germany, and I probably wouldn't be here now. And that's my story.
My story is about when my great-grandpa was in the war, and my grandma told me it. He was in the Navy during World War II, and he was a radio man in the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. and he also worked on boats. And he got a message one day that said that was in Morse code, and it said that, and he translated it, and it said that the war's over with Japan. And that's my story.
My story is about how my last name came to be. It's told by my great-grandmother every year. So when my great-great-grandfather came from Hungary, he changed his name from Salmeski to Salmeki to Americanize the name. And that's my story.
My story's about the time my great-grandmother met Benito Mussolini, the leader of Italy at the time when she was living there. So, long ago, when my great-grandmother lived in Italy, Sicily, Italy, the island off the coast, she was very good at arithmetic, which was what they used to call math back in the day. And so all the smart kids were chosen to meet Benito. So, one day, they all got a letter saying they were chosen to meet him. I'm not sure what day it was, but it was a very moderately weathered day because they were out on the beach on the coast. And they had to all wear black. They had girls could not wear any hair things in their hair, no bows, no hair bands. They just had to have their hair down flat. And the boys had to wear all black, and so did the girls. So black skirts, stockings, and shoes. And then then Benito pulled up in a black car. She said it had a convertible top. And so then they all had to do the Roman salute to him, is what they used to salute with him. Which is something. She tried to gesture it for me. But yeah, that's the time my great-grandmother met Benito Mussolini.
Okay, this is the story of how my aunt was kicked out of every daycare in Southington. One day my aunt had to go pick up her kids because they're still young, but they're older now. So she had to go pick up her kids, and she parked her car outside, went in, and she got her kids. And all of a sudden they heard like a crash, and a lady came in the door, and she said, "Does anybody own a silver van?" And my aunt said, "Yes, I do." And she said, well, it's in the parking lot. Or it's in a playground right now. And my aunt, like, froze. She's like, "What?" So the lady said, "If anything's broken, you're paying for it." She's like, "Yeah, no." So what she did is she had to call a tow truck, get it out of there, and she said she'd mail the check to fix it, but she never did. So the daycare sent out a notice to all the other daycares in Southington, said that don't let her in. So that's the story of how my aunt got banned from every daycare in Southington.
This is a story about how my grandfather got the Soldier of the Month. Well, that's what he told me. So basically the story goes that when he was in his unit or whatever, they were trying to pick the Soldier of the Month. Basically what Soldier Month was whoever's best dressed and shoes polished and everything. So basically they had everyone line up, and they would pick who was the best dressed. So everyone lined up, and then they decided to pick my grandfather, and he showed me a poster of that they picked him. So that's my story.
One time, my dad and me were in New York, and he told me a story about there was a commercial for a watch that was supposed to be indestructible, and the slogan was, every time they took it through a test, they said, "Is that Timex watch still ticking?" Then one day there was a car crash near his house, and the person in the car crash ended up losing their hand. It got cut off, and there was a watch on the hand, and so people started saying, "Is that Timex watch still ticking?"
My story is about how my grandfather started the consiglio business. Every time my family met for Christmas or another holiday, we always asked the story because we thought it was so cool. When my grandfather met my grandma, he was very young. When they started their family, my grandmother got cancer because she smoked, and my grandfather started real estate because his family and him were very poor, and they didn't have a lot of money. People that know my grandfather know that he's very kind and generous because he always help people in need. After my grandmother died, his kids followed in his footsteps, and he now supports our family when we're in debt. That is my story.
My story is about how my great grandpa and grandpa were in World War I and World War II. And in World War I, my great grandpa he never even came to America yet, and he couldn't really speak English at all, but he was in the Italian services. And my grandpa, who was in World War II, he was in the Navy section, and he was shipped out to Japan. And that is my story.